All right, good morning, everybody. Bruchim Aboyim, welcome, everyone. I always like to respond to comments on the channel, and here we have one from Oswald Bojangles, 5247. Dance. That dog up and died. The dog up and died. Okay. Clearly, all right, this is what Oswald Bojangles says. Clearly, you missed the part where the Pharisees tried tricking Jesus into sentencing an innocent woman to death. What? Now, everyone is familiar with the passage in the book of John, which is generally considered by scholars to be a pericope, which means it was something that was added later into the gospel and was not in the earlier manuscripts of the gospels. This is a story that appears in none of the synoptic gospels, only in John. And it's a story that I remember from my youth in public school. I had a history teacher who was a football coach, a Catholic school teacher, and a high school history teacher. I believe in that order. And we were in an honors class which had 7 kids, 3 of which, including me, were Jewish. And this teacher, I'm not going to mention his name, he's a good person. But I just always recall, and he would tell over this story, which had nothing to do with the history lesson that we were going through, and he was like, and Jesus, he showed those Jews when he said, he was without sin, cast the first stone. I don't know if I mentioned again, so since many scholars consider it to be a pericope, certain denominations like the Jehovah's Witnesses actually remove that whole narrative from their version of their Bible. But I don't see where there's any indication that this woman was innocent. She was caught in the very act, right? And the passage there says that the Pharisees sought to test Jesus. And being familiar with the Talmud, I would say that if this is a legitimate story, which it seems not to be, the biggest issue is that they were planning to stone her. And the Pharisees, quote unquote, I don't really like to use that term, but that's, again, what would be in there. The term Pharisee in the Talmudic parlance is actually used in a way quite similar to how you would see Jesus' admonitions in Matthew against the Pharisees. That there is a passage in Tractate Sota which speaks of Makas Prushim, the lashes or the smiting of Pharisees. It's mentioned briefly in the Mishnah, and the Gemara there brings a brisa saying that there are 7 types of Perushim, which you could transliterate as Pharisees, 5 of which are hypocrites, just like kind of what Jesus was saying about the Pharisees, quote unquote. The sages never called themselves the Pharisees. The term we see in the Mishnah in Yadayim comes up that's what the Sadducees called the Pharisees, called the followers of the rabbis, and their answer was, and that's all you have against the Pharisees? Which again, they kind of said, it's a point that they didn't say against us, meaning to say this term really initially, I would say, to a certain extent began as a slur. To a certain extent, it was one of those terms that sometimes, a certain group will be called by an offensive slur, and then they will adopt that term, and then they are like, oh, that's our word and we can use it. And I don't think it ever got really to that point, but it was kind of in mocking back to the Sadducees the way that the term was used. But nonetheless, the rabbis said that these 5 groups, which wouldn't even really be groups, I would almost consider it to be a diagnosis of a mental illness to a certain extent. And the only true Pharisees, the true Prushim, the true ones who practice abstinence for the right reasons, that's what the word Parush means, to abstain. So Prushim would be abstainers, people who practice forms of abstinence, is Parush Mira, Parush Me'ahava, is the one who abstains out of fear, or one who abstains out of love, meaning out of fear of God or love of God. Those are the true pious Pharisees. And again, it really wasn't a political party the way the Sadducees were. To compare the Pharisees and the Sadducees, as far as using the term Pharisee, it's more or less, they group together usually as scribes and Pharisees, and scribes is a word that is more used throughout the Talmud. But that's neither here nor there. But in any event, the punishment for adultery was not stoning. Other sins, breaking the Sabbath, worshipping idols, certain forms of male homosexuality would be, if, again, as we're going to explain, with proper witnesses and proper warning, would receive stoning. Generally, adultery, the punishment was strangulation, unless it was the daughter of a priest, in which case it was burning, but it wasn't burning at the stake. And stoning wasn't casting stones the way that you would see in the Monty Python movie, or in that weird TV movie adaptation of The Lottery. I don't know if anybody saw that. Really kind of missed the whole point of Jackson's, Shirley Jackson, right? Short story, The Lottery. I think I remember actually talking to that same history teacher about that. I think it was on NBC sometime in the mid-90s. I'm thinking 1995. Anyway, so as far as that particular pericope, if we forget about the historical mistake of using stoning, which obviously has a really strong, literary use, it's quite striking and beautiful. He who was without sin cast the first stone. Probably might sound somewhat different in Greek. I don't know Greek, but certainly King James rendered that quite beautifully and stirringly, and probably would not have quite the same instance, quite the same feeling if it was talking about one of the other 3 modes of execution, of strangulation or decapitation or burning, of which burning was pouring hot lead down the throat, and stoning was actually being pushed off a cliff. And if someone survives, then one really big stone would be thrown, and if someone survives, then the stones would be thrown down. So it's nothing like what we imagine, and I guess takes place in certain Islamic societies even today, as far as, like I said, something you would see out of a Monty Python movie or whatever. But back to that narrative, first of all, there's no indication that she was innocent, but his answer that he who was without sin cast the first stone actually is, as I've explained at other times on this channel, is the answer that the quote-unquote Pharisees would have given. If anything, Jesus passed the test, because the Bible is clear that a thing must be established by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, and they must be valid witnesses. The Bible says you could not take an ein chomas, you could not take what I guess you could translate as a corrupt or a violent witness. And so the way that the rabbis taught was that when it came to death penalty convictions, there should be particular effort to be put in, particularly in cases like this, other than really, pretty much other than murder or someone enticing to people to worship idols. And those were the two, and really essentially murder, because the very famous Mishnah in Makos that says that a court that executes someone once in 7 years is chavlonis, is destructive, and then they say it's not once in 7 years, once in 70 years. That's how rare actually executing the death penalty should be. And then the other rabbis, of course, they were living at a time when the death penalty had already been abolished among the Israelites, and really not by their own, but by the Roman persecutions. And the Romans, of course, executed people in much crueler ways than the way the Jews would execute. But in any event, two of the rabbis said if we were around when they still had the death penalty, we would abolish it. To which the response was, "Afhei marbe shorchidam b'Yisrael," that these are increasing murderers among Israel, meaning to say that we should have the death penalty on the books as a deterrent, but use it very sparingly. Pretty much, that's the opinion that comes out of the end of that Mishnah. But when it came to adultery cases, generally what would be done was to try exactly what in this story, which I consider to be fictitious, but exactly what Jesus did in this story is disqualify the witnesses. And then he said to the woman, "Who condemns you? No one. Go and sin no more." Obviously, if he is saying sin no more, he's not saying that she was innocent. But it's not in any sense that they were trying to trick him into sentencing to death. The way I read it, and again, this might just be my opinion, was that they were essentially happy that was the answer that Jesus gave, because that would be the rabbinical answer, is that in order to serve as a witness, one must be free of many major sins, even certain minor sins, even certain things that are not sins. For example, it's not technically a sin to gamble, according to Judaism, but it's close to sinning, it's in the periphery of sin, and so therefore someone who is a professional gambler may not serve as a witness. They're disqualified as a witness, and other examples. And so when it comes to death penalty cases, the attempt is to disqualify the witnesses. Now the next part, you missed at every point in the Gospels about the wicked heart of the Pharisees who handed the Son, and this is blasphemy, over to the Romans without a valid charge to execute him. Missed the point so much. After hearing the word of God, you became a Pharisee. I hope you come back and see the errors of your ways and come back into the flock of who they say is their Messiah. Now, first of all, to say I became a Pharisee is kind of strange. I mean, I was born Jewish, whatever that means. My mother is Jewish. Yes, my father was a Christian, and he did have me baptized as a baby, but never really gave me much Christian instruction. I was raised with both Christianity and Judaism in the house, but the religious aspect was much more Jewish in the house that I grew up in. And I really only read the books that Christians added to the Bible after adopting many years of living and studying committed Jewish life. So you don't know anything about me to say that statement. I never read the books that Christians call the New Testament until after already, I guess, quote unquote, becoming a Pharisee. And reading those books, I consider them to be absolutely fictitious. They are clearly self-contradictory. And, there's one famous Jewish apologist who always says that God invented Mormons so Christians can know how Jews feel. So if you could say the same thing about Islam, meaning a Muslim would say to you, Christian Bojangles, Oswald Bojangles. If you had read through the Quran, or a Mormon might say, although Mormons are really nice people and they are very polite and don't really talk like that, but I know maybe a fundamentalist Mormon might say, I know some pretty radical, well, I know one very radical Mormon, and he's kind of not looked upon very nicely by other Mormons, but if a Mormon would say, oh, you read the Book of Mormon and you still decided to reject it. Or a Muslim would say, you read the Quran and you still decided to reject it. It's the same thing. But reading through books that Christians call the New Testament, I don't understand how they really understand it without a Jewish perspective. So many of the things in there are very, very Jewish. But nonetheless, I do reject those books because their message clearly contradicts the actual Bible. But nonetheless, I recognize the good things that Christianity and Islam and Mormonism and all these other religions have brought to the world, as our rabbis have through history. Maimonides said that even though Christians and Muslims persecuted Jews throughout history, and so it's been difficult for our people to have these religions in the world, nonetheless, it's that these two religions serve a great purpose in spreading monotheism and spreading the messages of the Bible. Rabbi Emden, much later in the 1600s, very famously wrote a letter to the Christian community extolling, I guess maybe in the 1700s actually, extolling Christianity as spreading the Torah more than the synagogue ever did. And it's true, and so we owe a debt to the church that they spread our books to the world. Just so happens that they spread some silly other books, Greek books, that they added on, which have a few nice things that they took from us too. How many people think that love thy neighbor was only in the New Testament, what Christians call the New Testament, when it's right out of Leviticus? All these people are like, oh, Leviticus with all those laws. Leviticus is where love thy neighbor comes from, right? And so, of course, if this character Jesus ever existed, there's no way to really know of any true historical Jesus. The only Jesus we know is the Jesus that the church preaches. And so therefore, it's all well and good, it's very interesting, and of course, Thomas Jefferson went through taking out just the teachings without the miracles and the divinity and so forth. Everybody knows about that. For which reason, I remember when I was a rabbi down in Virginia, the Muslims there would say they wanted to make Thomas Jefferson an honorary Muslim because they saw Jesus more as a teacher or a prophet, but not as God, the way that Jefferson did. But in any event, the way that you're expressing yourself, Mr. Bojangles, is just in error. I respect that you're a Christian. Go ahead, be a great Christian. March on, Christian soldiers. Keep fighting for decency and morality and the good ethics. And if that theology makes you feel good, I have no problem with it. You're not hurting anybody that you believe in the Trinity or whatever. I think it's somewhat silly, particularly the idea that Jesus as a human being is uniquely God in a way that no other human being is. But you do you. You're not hurting anybody by believing that, but I only really generally fight back when someone comes at me like this, and that's pretty much it. So thank you for watching. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe, comment. I would still encourage Christians, go to church. I heard Hugh Hewitt on the radio. He said a New Year's resolution. He said try to go to church at least 26 times this year. The Catholics make it kind of easy because you could go to Mass any day, and for your Sunday obligation you could go Saturday, whatever it is. I would say the same thing. If you're Muslim, try to make it to Juma, and if you can do more, usually Muslims are a little bit better at making it to Juma than Christians are making it to church, and the same thing for the Jews. If you're able, I would say it's better to pray at home than to drive on the Sabbath, but if you have a good synagogue within walking distance, I have a problem with that, is that my synagogue, I'd like to grow, I'd like it to be bigger, so I'm trying to find a synagogue close enough to my full-time job that I could spend the Sabbath serving the synagogue. But here we are. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe, comment, and we'll see you later. Oh, you know what? I guess he wasn't talking to me. He was talking to our friend David. Well, I wish David well. David knows what he's doing. He's a much better teacher than another teacher. All right, God bless you all. All right, how do I turn this thing off?